Mhm.
Um,
But Jay, you just hit on something that's even more beautiful, right? Because you're right. Back in the day, we had to do all these manual steps to do all these things, right? But with this whole like infrastructure as code, like vitalization, we have all these we have basically everything codified, so you can just keep duplicating it. And if I wanted to spin it down, I just have to tell like Flux go destroy all your resources, and then just go do it again, right? And it's still all like there to just go recreate based on like this code.
Hi, I'm Jay Faulkner, and this is the G Research Open Source Software Outreach Podcast, the Gross Out Podcast. We're going to gross you out with real stories about what it's like to work in and around open source. And today, our guest is someone who sort of has focused on that throughout her career, but maybe has a little bit of a different perspective than a lot of folks. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Pinky?
Hi, I'm Priyanka Ravi. I also go by Pinky, and I'm a platform tech advocate here at G Research.
So what does that mean exactly? What does a platform tech advocate do?
It's a good question. So I'm more focused on how do we keep our engineers happy? How do we keep our end users happy of our tools? How do we make sure that everything's kind of seamless? Basically, I'm here to help people. That's my whole goal, is to help people, educate people on the different technologies, share things that I found, things like that.
Yeah, that's definitely a big part of the open source ethos. So I think that'll be nice. Can you tell folks if they might have known you from an open source community or some stuff you've done in the past? Maybe give us a little tour of how your career has
Yeah,
traveled, and maybe cross some open source bridges on the way.
for sure. Okay, so yeah, my path is a little more untraditional because it's more of an end user to supporting the open source tool kind of story. And actually, I don't know. I'm sure a lot of us have done that. But I started my career. I studied in computer science at UT Arlington, and then I went to State Farm. I did an internship there. Loved it so much. I ended up full time, and I was a full stack developer there first. And I was working on a tool that was used by a lot of other teams. And the requests started flooding in, and we really couldn't keep up with them. It was a lot of other teams using it, so we ended up implementing this idea called inner source. And at the time, I had never done anything like that. So I actually had to do a lot of research on like the open source community, how governance works, how, um, you know, uh, pull requests and reviews, and just being a maintainer slash owner, what that looks like. And so I implemented that project, those projects being inner sourced at State Farm, and ended up helping people learn the tool. Then they took it back to their teams, they taught them and started putting in their own contributions. Then they became trusted maintainers. That whole story of like, how do you do inner source at a company? It was very fun. And then one of my best friends actually hosted an open source day at State Farm, and that was really amazing. They pulled in all these beginner friendly contributions that people could do, and that was actually my first contribution to open source, was through that event. And then I ended up moving to a different team that was the delivery experience team, the delivery engineering team. And that team became basically the GitOps team. And I was tasked with leading the Kubernetes GitOpsification, if you will.
So let's
Yeah,
actually let's stop.
yeah,
Let's define a term
yeah,
here a little bit,
yeah. I
because
can
it's
define GitOps
no,
for
I
sure. Oh,
actually I don't want to just gloss over it, because it was interesting.
okay.
I saw a comment on LinkedIn the other day from
Yeah,
someone talking about how DevOps started in 2013 when Kubernetes was created. I get the
crazy. Is that
impression
true?
that
That's
you
crazy.
would not agree with that necessarily. So
That's
why don't you tell us a little bit
crazy.
about GitOps, and maybe give us some history of like where it came from, and where you think it's going?
I don't know if I would agree that DevOps was created with Kubernetes, but I think
No,
because the
I
concept
don't
of,
either
yeah,
at all.
I figured you didn't. But like obviously DevOps is just like the concept of like, how do you get like CI/CD, right? How do you get to like from Git to, or whatever you're storing in SVN, if you will. I don't know. Whatever you're storing it in, to like, how do you get it out to production, right? That's existed forever. I think maybe what they're emphasizing is like all these like newer CI/CD tools maybe are newer. But like that concept has existed. I'm sure Jenkins didn't just like, I don't know if that, I don't
Well,
actually know when Jenkins was created.
well,
But
it was Hudson. So if you ever hear
uh,
people talk about Hudson, Hudson's what turned into
mm.
Jenkins when it forked out.
Fair,
But the
fair.
The interesting thing is you say GitOps. Now that
Yeah,
as a term is not something I'm super familiar with, but I
that's different.
imagine it has to do with like the patterns
Yeah.
that, I mean, I guess for me, someone who's done system administration a while, someone who's seen it at lots of companies, pretty normal to me. Like you put your
Yeah.
configuration into a Git repository and manage it like you would code. But that wasn't always kind of an obvious thing, was it?
And that's not GitOps. So I think that's where some of the
Oh,
confusion comes in is like people think, oh, if my code is in Git and I'm using it as like the single source of truth, that's GitOps. Well, if like for a lot of GitOps purists, which you know, like
no.
that's not real GitOps. So like the GitOps is basically defined by like the GitOps working group and all the Open GitOps project as 4 principles. So one is, yeah, you store all your code in Git. You have like repository. There's a lot of things that come with that version, auditable, right? You have your like history there. So, and actually in our case, right, I was at State Farm, which is a regulated industry. At the time we even had a bank, right? So we were very highly regulated and we had like to have auditors every year. So it was like a whole discussion of like, okay, how are auditors now going to use GitLab to like for change management, right? That's a big deal because we were using like other tools for specifically putting in change requests and then a manager approves it. So we had to do all of these things like locking down a repo to make sure that that works. But so that's the first one is having like that trail Git. That's the first. But then the second one is like the idea is you want to have your code actually being pulled. So, most models these days are like something that's running a pipeline in Git or wherever, and that's pushing your code to like Kubernetes or wherever. But the idea of GitOps is that it's actually supposed to be pulled in from something that's running. So, like in our case, right? I'm going to be talking about Flux. That's where I did a lot of work. And with Flux, it actually deploys onto your Kubernetes cluster. And then it's listening to your Git repo and it's running on like sync intervals. So it's basically constantly making sure that if someone goes in and edits something, it's actually going to set it back to your desired state. So it's doing a lot more than just pushing code out. It's making sure that, you know, what's actually said in code is what's actually in your environment.
So it's almost like you in whereas most deployment methodologies, and I definitely did a lot of this before 2013 as well. You
Right.
might would like you might would like press a button that said deploy,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
would go bundle up your software into a tarball or something, ship it
You
somewhere,
still had
extract it, and
tests
go.
and stuff.
But
Yeah.
well, I mean, we're talking in this case, it was you had to pass the test to get into the repo. So by the time you were there, things had already been tested. But and then we'd push it out. But we definitely still had cowboys in that environment who would go out there, who would edit things directly on the chef server and it would be
Yeah.
honestly, as an operator, mildly infuriating because, like you said,
Yeah.
that audit trail is so important. Being able,
Yes.
if you're at 3 a.m. getting paged, you better be able to go look at what was changed, at midnight
Hmm.
or at
Hmm.
10 p.m. or whatever. And so I really like that, but I still don't necessarily understand why the fact it's pooled is so
Hmm.
significant. Because like I feel like you could push enforcement down. There's
Hmm.
some config management that do that. But I've actually never seen someone implement a pool-based deployment in production. So I'm curious what that looks like and what you gain from it.
Yeah. So basically, like one of the biggest draws for like in my perspective is configuration drift, right? Like you mentioned, someone going in and like changing things themselves. Well, now you don't have that, right? Like that's kind of beautiful. It's kind of crazy that like something will just go reset it. So the way it works is basically it runs on like a 10-minute sync or something, like whatever you can set it. It's adjustable. I think we had it at 5 minutes at one point. It was a little it was a little noisy, but um it runs on that 5-minute interval and it just it sees the files and it just applies them. That's it. Like it's like making sure that that's what's actually out there and super invaluable to be honest because until someone runs that pipeline again, nothing's going to get reset, right? It's just like whatever people are doing. And for a company that like we had it pretty locked down to where like people didn't really just like have access to the Kubernetes clusters, it's nice to know that something's making sure things are like running smoothly and the way that they're supposed to be. And like I can feel confident that if I wrote this code, like if I wrote, these files, these YAMLs, this is what's actually being deployed. So that's one
Yeah.
benefit. There's also a lot of other benefits of like, I don't now have to have like a deployment pipeline that could fail, right? I have a tool that's just continuously doing this. And I can also, like you said, I can go push a button and tell it, hey, go pick up a change. I don't want to wait the 5 minutes. So,
That's actually, and like you kind of identified something I hadn't considered. So like there's two
mhm,
things. One is my favorite model when I was like, I would say when I was growing up in operations was what I'd call the disposable server model. You provision the server once. When you're done provisioning it, you wipe
yep,
it and you start
yep.
over. And it's
Hmm.
a similar idea to what you're talking about, except for maybe what you're talking about is a little bit faster. So that's kind of cool.
Hmm.
Um,
But Jay, you just hit on something that's even more beautiful, right? Because you're right. Back in the day, we had to do all these manual steps to do all these things, right? But with this whole like infrastructure as code, like vitalization, we have all these like we have basically everything codified, so you can just keep duplicating it. And if I wanted to spin it down, I just have to tell like Flux go destroy all your resources, and then just go do it again, right? And it's still all like there to just go recreate based on like this code.
the thing that I like the most about this conversation is that I've definitely had conversations with people who are new to the industry who sort of see the destination but don't always understand the journey it took to get there and how amazing it is. How it's like it's honestly a testament to like our generation of people who built up this DevOps stuff that it's sort of taken for granted now. Of course, your configuration's stored in a central location and enforced everywhere. What sort of crazy person would just SSH to servers and configure them? And the answer is me 15
We've
years
done
ago,
it. We've
right?
done
Like
yeah.
this automation is automating things that we were doing with our own hands, that you were describing people at State Farm doing with their own hands, that
Yes, yeah.
I did. And now we've got,
Mhm,
tools like Flux helping make that easy, tools like Ironic making the server provisioning easy. And all of these bits and bops, which
mhm.
make it so that someone walking into the tech industry today, you have to bring so much less context than you do.
Yep.
Oh my gosh, people talk about vibe coding. Vibe coding is built on the backs of all of this massive amount of automation that's handling a large portion of the repeatable stuff so that folks just have a clean
Yeah,
platform to build something on. And that's so valuable, and
yeah.
it's the kind of stuff that's often invisible. But we're off the beaten track. You were talking about how
So
there were four enumerable parts of
yeah,
GitOps, and I think the first one was making sure there's an audit trail. The
yeah.
second one is pulling your code instead of
Is
pushing.
versioning. So the first one is that there's a Git repo. And then the second one is that there's an audit. I think the second one is actually that it's versioned and auditable. Sorry, I'm like blanking a little in a minute. The third one is actually that there's like something, there's an operator basically that's pulling in your changes. And the fourth one is where it becomes okay, something is actually running on a sync cycle. That's the one where it's like, that's where you get away from configuration drift. So it's running on like this sync cycle or reconciliation cycle is what we kind of call it. It's reconciling the differences and it's deploying the deployments and stuff. So it's really cool. There's also like a Terraform controller, which is neat. So or Open Tofu controller that yeah, I should say. But it's really cool because it can do your tofu or Terraform deployments. And that's really neat, right? Because now you can do everything through it. So but to go back to how I got involved in this. So I was tasked with like, leading the Kubernetes GitOpsification, if you will. And we were researching and we're like, actually, I should say there are a couple of tools that do this. Flux is the one that was the first one on the scene that was actually the tool that GitOps was coined for by Alexis Richardson at a company called WeaveWorks that no longer exists. But so that was I was like we when we looked up GitOps, like that's really what it was. We looked up GitOps at State Farm and we're like, that was the first thing that came up, and we're like, all right, let's go with it. And I love this tool. It was so easy to get started with. We just started playing with it every day. We test out new features and I just got more and more obsessed with it. I don't know. I just really love it. And then we met this team of developer experience engineers that were working for a company again called WeaveWorks and started chatting with them. They were helping us with some of our issues when we were doing our migration because Flux actually started out as one version and then it was reworked to be a lot better and to use Kubernetes controllers. So it's a lot more efficient and it can also be kind of more modular and like pulled apart. And so when that rework happened, we had to migrate because it wasn't like it wasn't just like an easy switch. And so we had to do all that rework. They were helping us with it. So we got to know them. And then we went to KubeCon, and it was my first KubeCon. And it was also the first GitOps con that was taking place. And we were speaking at it about how we were doing actually our Terraform deployments at the time using Terraform Cloud. And met the team, started talking to them. They were like, hey, we have a posting on our team for a developer experience engineer. Do you want to come do that? And work with Flux, like as more of like a community member. And I was like, that is so exciting. Yes. So I went, and basically for 2 years that I was at that company, I was just, Flux was my life. I was doing conferences. I was working with end users. I was doing anything I could, any podcast that would have me, any place I could go talk about the tool, any collaboration I could do with other products to kind of show off what I could do. I was getting myself out there and doing that. And that was a really, honestly, it was the most fun I've had in my career. It was just the best. I've met so many really cool people. The tech advocate space, like the DevRel space, is, I mean, you know this just as well as I do. It's so wholesome. It's just such a nice, friendly community where everyone's kind of just like uplifting each other. They want to see how their tools work with your tools, and like collaborations happen really naturally. And like within the CNCF, I just love, I should have said Flux is actually a now graduated project in the CNCF. It wasn't graduated when I joined WeaveWorks, but yeah. So being a part of the CNCF was just magical. I genuinely loved that community. I think having a project in the CNCF is such a cool experience too, because they do a lot to help drive adoption for your product too. Having your project donated to the CNCF, I think there's a lot of benefits to it that people don't realize. Like, people look at the environment. So, like, if I'm an end user, right, and I want to see what tools I should be using for CI/CD, I mean, for me, a lot of times I would start with the CNCF's ecosystem and see like what tools are out there, right? And having your tool be something that shows up there is invaluable. It's amazing.
Well, and it's nice because some of the recent reorganizations at the foundation level sort of build a synergy between like the OpenStack side of the house and like the CNCF side, because they're all Linux Foundation projects at this point.
Exactly.
And so, like I, I'm actually not as familiar with the developer relations community as it seems. Like I'm sort of an
Okay.
engineer who plays podcast host every now and then. But I do think it's really common among people who are like dedicated open source engineers to forget that we're a little bit of salespeople too. In the same way that you've got to
Exactly.
be a little bit of a salesperson when you're doing like a job interview, you've got to
Hmm.
make that person want to work there.
Yep.
Every time you're answering a bug report, every time you're
Yes.
working on an issue, every time you code review someone's code, you're representing and you're telling that person whether or not they should continue working on your project or not. And
Yes.
in that sense, I think like developer relationships, like, oh gosh, someone was telling me that I was going to be out of a job in a year because AI was going to do all the coding. And I told them software is interpersonal. All software is interpersonal. Software is here to deliver something to
Yeah.
someone. And at a
Mhm.
level, you're never going to get rid of that human who's doing that translation, whether it be, someone going from punch cards to using Excel, or maybe it's software developers going from using assembler to C to I write in Python now. Well, to be fair, I write in AI prompts, some half of the time now too. And this is just the sort of migration in the same way that we've talked about with operations, like that operations has matured. And some people might call it DevOps and have like one set of mores. Some people might call it SRE and have a different, or GitOps.
Yes.
And these all have their own little, but the ideas there are still the same, that automation is the key, repeatability is the key.
Hmm.
Um, but I want to kind of steer back a little bit towards some of the
Hmm.
inner source stuff, because
Yeah.
a recurring theme on this podcast has been, sort of how to interact with the business, capital B, the business, wherever you might work, someone you're trying to sell it to at another company, whatever, how to communicate the value of open source to business folks. And when you tell me the story of inner source at State Farm, it sounds like it might be like an uphill climb, because at every large company I've worked at, there's been some sense of an insular nature, some sense of like almost territory guarding.
Yeah.
And I feel like if you're trying to introduce inner source at a company that maybe isn't already invested in open source, that maybe doesn't already have that ethos, there might be a lot of culture to push back against. And I'm
Yeah.
curious how you navigated that, or maybe if you were able to give advice to Pinky, who was starting that initiative way back then,
Yeah.
is there some sort of thing you would have told yourself that, you think might would have made that transition a little easier, or maybe would have at least helped you feel better about how difficult it was as you were making your way there?
2 words, leadership buy-in. It's everything. If you can't get leaders of especially of the teams that you're trying to get to come, like, work on some of the stuff you're, like, managing or maintaining or owning, it's impossible, right? They can't do work for another team if their, like, leadership isn't on board with that. And they have to be allocated time to work on these other things. So one way that I got kind of lucky is that State Farm. I'm not advocating for safe. I want to be clear, but State Farm at the time was running in a safe, and by safe I mean agile, like a safe agile way. And what that means is like there's these different teams and they're all working on like the same tools, but they're working on the same stuff. So you kind of have to make sure that they're not hitting each other's stuff. So we have like these PI planning sessions where they like draw like threads across things and make sure that like this has to be done before that, right? I know it's a lot. I was never on a team that operated that way,
I've
but
worked at
I
one
worked with them.
company that
Yeah,
used Safe,
yeah.
and that number will remain at one forever if I have anything to
It's
say
a
about it. That
it's
is
a it's an experience.
is
I think if
agile
I
if agile is managing 1,000 teams dependencies
it's
during the worst
exactly
week of your life once a quarter.
it's so intense, and the crazy part was my team was actually Kanban, so we were just there, like, as support to kinda see, like, "Okay, where can we plug in?" But we weren't actually involved, so we were kinda just, like, support there. But the
What
okay,
are
but
you,
the good thing
chickens? Yeah.
but the good thing was that, like, because it worked out that way, we kind of we could just say across the board, give us like 10% of everyone's time to work on this, right? Or at least 10% of these people's time. Because there's someone kind of managing all these teams in between, we could easily say across these teams, give us this time. So it worked out pretty well. The other area was a little bit more of a struggle. We had to prove value. And basically, it came down to look, we don't have the time to put in all these requests that you are asking for and you need in order. Because what it was like a randomized test data generator that was using JavaScript and other things. And it had like every time insurance business logic would change, like, oh, if you're 25, now there's this extra value. That happens a lot in insurance. It's so annoying. But every time that would change, the like UI screen would change, right? And then the data that's necessary would change. So every time one of those logics changes, like someone on our team has to go make a change. And it was too much for us. So we started getting to the point where we're like, look, y'all want these changes and we don't have the people. So y'all have to help us help you, help us help you, basically. But also, it's more than that, right? The conversation was when you become comfortable committing to this project and we see that you have that like care for this project that we have, we'll make you a maintainer and an owner even at one point, like some point, and you will then be like our advocates for this project and kind of spreading the seed more. So it's really valuable at a large company, to be honest, because a lot of times people don't realize what you're working on. But then now this person's working on it too, and they're on this other team, and now they're telling their team, and it grew pretty. Honestly, watching it spread was the coolest part about that experience. What would I tell myself though? I think it takes time, and that's okay. I think
Yeah.
it's really easy to put a lot of pressure on yourself and be like, "You have to get this figured out." And oh my god, it's taken we like we're not there yet. That no, you there was so much value selling that goes with trying to implement inner source, but it's so valuable when you can't open source a project, but you want to make sure that it's taken care of the way you want. Go for it. But I would say make sure you look into governance models. I think that's a really big one too. I didn't know a lot about that. I learned it along the way.
Well, the interesting thing is that, like, I feel like if we replaced a few words in there, you could have been talking about open source and not inner source. Like, if For
Absolutely.
instance, the OpenStack team at Gross has basically a standing spend 1/5 of your time reviewing other
Yep.
people's code, participating in the community, being a generic upstream citizen. And you have to specifically carve it out. You have to say this is a priority. You have to say, I don't care if we have something that's due in a week and you can't have that time,
Hmm. Hmm.
because the second you sort of start to cross that threshold, there's not a lot of turning back. You're just building up technical debt. But it's not like if you're inside a company, it's not like if it's in your own team, it's you're putting that on someone else's credit card. You're putting it on that internal team who was nice enough to give you commit access. You're giving it to, that project that accepted your patch. And so I think that's really valuable about having to make sure that you specifically set aside time.
Yes.
That really, I mean, it's
That's the hardest part is getting people to like product managers to give up their team's time. The
well, it
hardest
takes a
part.
it takes a long-term view. Like, that's actually one of the things I've really appreciated about this job is this is one of the first places I've worked at that, really takes a long-term look at this, that says, if we're building our, entire estate on a foundation of these open source technologies,
Mhm.
and we're making investments in hardware, in software, in scale that are going to span years and years and years. If you don't put that same investment, even just a cursory investment,
Mhm.
into maintaining the software that does that, then you're going to be either faced with a crisis when
Mhm.
some security issue happens that you didn't see, or a crisis when you have to migrate off of it immediately instead of on
Yep.
your own terms. And, that's not, I'm sure that one day OpenStack is not going to be the best cloud software in the world. That day is not today. But if it comes, the fact that G Research is invested in maintaining it means that they're going to get to choose
Yes.
when and what they transition to, and that's super valuable because you don't want some other company that maybe has a different set of values than you, that maybe has a different set of things driving them, to be the ones who get to set that timer for
No, you're
you.
actually right. Yeah, for sure.
Uh, so
I like that point actually a lot. Also, another thing is if you lose talent, you have the knowledge at least dispersed across the company versus like one team or maybe one person. And we've seen that a lot, right?
I mean, quite frankly, Rackspace trained me up on how to work on OpenStack, and I'm working on OpenStack now. They aren't having to pay me a dime. They're
Yeah.
happily using my code. It
Right.
it is it is an investment where, like, if you
Yes.
this is where the DevRel stuff comes in too, the developer
Yeah.
relationship pieces, because inherently, if you are using an open source project or solving a problem, you should be invested in wanting other people to use that open source project to solve that problem because it spreads the load. The more
Yeah.
people who are using Armada, maybe the less resources G Research has to push to it directly. Or maybe, we accelerate. Maybe we do
Hmm.
more and better things with more resources. And that's what's always kind of exciting to me when I think about this. But
Agreed.
we
Agreed.
know that with open source, inner source, whatever, it's not always a pretty picture. It's actually really hard. We've talked a lot about that kind of here about, getting from point A to point B is never a straightforward path, and it's almost like a rite of passage we all have to go through. So most folks who've been working in or around open source have some sort of gross moment that they've encountered where, maybe something seemed really difficult or really hard to overcome, but they
Yeah.
were able to get there. So, like, can you maybe share a gross moment with someone in our audience who might be struggling and help them understand how you got out of that one?
So I thought about this a lot last night. I was like, what am I gonna say for this? I think I think the best one to talk about is actually the one that I've never talked about. And that's dealing with the death of an open source company, right? And that's something I went through recently. That's actually how I ended up at G Research. So I was at this company called WeaveWorks, and they, like I said, were the company that coined the term GitOps and created a tool called Flux and donated it to the CNCF. And in December of 2022, maybe, they went under. And it was devastating. Now you have this project that was primarily maintained by one company. What happens, right? I mean, it's a tale that we see all the time. The good thing about Flux is that at least within the CNCF to become like a graduated project, you have to have, maintainers across so many companies. You can't just have like all your maintainers be at one company. So the good thing is we had that, and there was, some lucky things such as like control plane picked up a lot of the engineers from Flux. They're actually running an event called FluxCon. That's for the first time. FluxCon has never existed. I don't know if you've heard of a tool called Argo. Argo is Flux's competitor. Argo has had like an ArgoCon for many years now, right? And so, like being part of Flux, it was kind of like sad just watching this competitor get, because it has so many companies backing it, right? And there's so many more people that can sponsor events for that project. And it just gets more outreach. And it kind of was sad sitting on the sidelines, I guess, for a project that didn't get the same kind of outreach besides like all of us trying to put in this effort, right? So I actually cried when I saw the announcement for FluxCon, like genuine tears, because I was like, it just feels like a moment of kind of just, I didn't realize how sad it was watching like a competitor have this conference year after year, and like we don't get to have those same luxuries, right? So I'm really excited about that. I think what I want to say is like open source first companies can work. I don't want it to sound like I'm sitting here being like open source first is not the way. I think we were a little bit more on the unlucky side of things, but I also want to say like when you have an open source project, don't rely on one open source first company. Don't have all your people from there because, things happen. Funding falls through. 2 years ago was really rough for funding for a lot of startups. A lot of companies started pulling funding from all of us, right? So I think having that sort of like model of having all these different companies that can kind of make sure that the project still thrives after if that happens to them, I
Well,
think that
I
was
think
really
there's two
valuable.
things here that you maybe glossed over, and I don't know if it's things that I know that sometimes when you're in the middle of it, you can't see it. But
Yeah,
the
I don't
one thing
know.
is that it's very clear that what y'all created in Flux, even if the
Mhm.
company is gone, y'all created something bigger than yourself. And the folks who worked at that company who made it, every environment using that is something. And that's a
Yeah.
real achievement in a way of like, I know that for me, I've done something in OpenStack that, we've
Yeah.
enabled that just like you've done something in Flux, and that has
Mhm.
meaning. The
Yeah.
other one is a little bit more cynical. And I kind of noticed some of this in our inner source talk too, is that people don't like applying supply and demand to open source, but it works. So why did that company that invested in Flux not invest in it when the previous company existed? Because they didn't have
Yeah.
they had all the supply they needed of that resource.
Yeah.
So this is something I personally struggle with a lot as an open source
Really interesting
maintainer.
perspective.
Sometimes you have to leave things undone
Yeah.
because if
No,
you're
you're right.
willing to fill in every crack, if you're willing to dot every I, that's going to end up being what you do. You're going to dot every I, you're going to cross every T. You're not going to be able to work on the things that are going to make bigger impacts. And I'm not saying that that stuff's not important. I am the
No,
king of thinking that
you're
stuff is important,
honestly,
but
your
it's so
thinking is
important. You've got to
brilliant.
get everyone doing it. You can't just have that relying on one person or one particularly philanthropic company, right? Like in this case, G
Yeah.
Research is doing the heavy lifting for how many large companies that don't have a development presence in OpenStack right now, to put it just flat on the surface. And that's
Yes.
because, until there's a threat that something's going to go away. We see this in our OpenStack community all the
Yes.
time when we go to retire a project that no one's had any interest in for years. And then
Mhm.
all of a sudden, the person who's built their business on this project existing emerges from the woodwork. And
You're
hey,
so
glad to
right.
have them. Come help us
Mhm.
out. But I really wish you would have been here for the last two
You're
years when
so
it was
right.
still in time from other people.
You're hitting on something, when as you were talking, a light bulb just went off, and it's something I've never really thought about. It just kind of made sense to me. But at Flux, like especially after everything happened, and people were kind of more dispersed. A lot of times an RFC would come in, and it's like, okay, can you make it work with like Azure better, right? Like, but then it's like, let's push back on Microsoft and have them do it. So it was a lot of that where it was like we ended up like having a lot of collaborations between our maintainers and like the different companies that were requesting things, and then we kind of push back on them and be like, come help. Like you come do this merge request. And you're right. That actually also helps create an environment where there's more people now invested in this project and working on it. That's really cool.
Well, and there's this weird thing when you've worked on an open source project like that of like you almost have to wear multiple hats at the same time, right? Like I
Absolutely.
am an OpenStack upstream developer. When I make decisions that are right for OpenStack upstream, I have to do the right thing, even if it's maybe not the best thing for G research. And that's not
You're so
easy.
right.
And it goes the other way too. So you just have to, you sort of have to balance it. And when with that
Yeah.
OpenStack hat on, the more people use OpenStack, the more jobs there's going to be. If
Yeah.
the company I work
Mhm.
at doesn't use OpenStack anymore, the more opportunities there's going to be for the MLH fellows who are
Yeah.
being brought up for the outreach interns that the folks at Red Hat are bringing up.
Mhm.
The more spots there are for everyone. It's
Mhm.
not a zero sum game. You can
You're
add
so
to
right.
it. You can add to the size of it. And I mean, I think, gonna circle it all the way back around, put a bow on it. Like that is what G Research has been really good at. And I'm glad to have you as a representative there in Dallas, working with us. And to note, G Research is always hiring. You can go work in the Dallas office with Pinky or in London with any number of folks we've talked to. You can go to gresearch.com/vacancies. We'll have a link to that in the description. Um, and, as always, we do thank G Research giving us the time to put this podcast up, to put the content up for you to sort of, hopefully mentor you in bringing your company through to being a contributor there. So on behalf of Pinky, myself, our producer, Ben, I just want to say thanks for listening. This has been the G Research Open Source Software Outreach Podcast, GR-OSS OUT Podcast. Have a nice evening.